Lord Darzi was commissioned 9 weeks ago to do a review of the NHS, and he managed to do it in an incredibly fast time, very well researched, within 9 weeks. Unbelievable, really impressive, really impressive guy. 9-week report, proofread, checked, all the facts checked, printed, everything, fantastic. He even managed to do a little video to go along with it.
I've worked in the NHS for more than 30 years, but I've been shocked by what I've found during this investigation, not just in health service, but in the state of the nation's health. We want to deliver high quality care for all, but far too many people are waiting for too long. And in too many clinical areas, quality of care has gone backwards. My colleagues in the NHS are working harder than ever, but our productivity has fallen. We get caught up frantically trying to find beds that have been axed, or using IT that is outdated, or trying to work out how to get things done because operational processes are overwhelmed. It sucks the joy away from our work. We became clinicians to help patients get better, not to go into battle with a broken system. We need to rebalance the system towards care in the community rather than adding more and more staff to hospitals. And we need more honest conversation about performance. The NHS is now an open book. In the last 15 years, the NHS was hit by 3 shocks: austerity and starvation of investment, confusion caused by top-down reorganization, and then the pandemic, which came with resilience at all-time low. 2 out of the 3 of those shocks were choices made in Westminster. It took more than a decade for the NHS to fall into disrepair, so it's going to take time to fix it. But we in the NHS have turned things around before, and I'm confident we will do it again.
To talk about the report from Lord Darzi, we've got Dr. Bob Gill, who we know well as an NHS campaigner, and Nicholas Csergo, who's from the Socialist Health Association. Before I bring you both in, I'd just like to play a bit more, show a bit more of the report, and then I'll bring you in. The first thing that I couldn't help noticing was that there's absolutely no mention of PFI, the impact of PFI on the NHS, which is crippling in terms of costs. We're talking about hundreds of billions of pounds of debt. And the other aspect that isn't covered is the outsourcing of parts of the NHS to the private sector, not mentioned in one page or one paragraph of the report. But we do have in the report other things that are mentioned that give an indication of where we're going. This is one of the bullets that in the report. Here we are. The recent introduction of volume incentives for elective recovery have had a powerful galvanizing effect that shows how much performance can be unlocked by the combination of resources and incentives. For-profit insourcing companies are offering to do NHS work for 20 to 30% below the national tariff. They use NHS facilities, clinicians and consumables. One of the crucial differences between insourcing companies and the NHS provider trusts in which they work is their fundamentally different approach to individual and team incentives. And that to me rings alarm bells, because he's actually just saying that competition from outside is good for the NHS. So he's talking about that. This is also brought in with this paragraph. Under the NHS constitutions, patients continue to have the right to choose their provider, but in practice, patients are not routinely asked where they would like to receive their care. To exercise their rights, they must demand them of their own volition. Nearly half of adults are unaware that they have a legal right to choose. Practical effect has been that the quasi-market for elective care services has been weakened. This is despite the fact that choice remains popular, with 75% of the public agreeing that they should have a right to choose their provider in opinion polls. The idea of choice why is there this idea that people have to have choice and they just can't have good service? I don't really understand that. The other thing that I picked up from it was this is Wes Streeting talking about the time it took Lord Darzi to bring out this report.
I'm a bit baffled how a report of such magnitude can be compiled and completed in 9 weeks. How detailed can it be?
It really is, and the proof of the pudding's in the eating. Over 300 data sets, huge engagement in the consultation, an expert reference group. To be honest, Kay, I've drawn a different conclusion. If we can do a thorough piece of work like this in 8 weeks, why is Whitehall so often slow on so many other agendas?
I mean, that's incredible. He says that it's fantastic. He's got it out in 9 weeks. This totally contrasts with his response to the winter fuel payments when no report was made at all into it. So how he can actually talk about how great that is and how he can turn it around so quickly, but he couldn't be bothered with winter fuel payments. This is another bit that is unnecessary from the report. I don't know why Lord Darzi mentions this. It's taken more than a decade for the NHS to fall into disrepair, so improving it will take time. Waiting times can and must improve quickly, but it will take years rather than months to get the health service back to peak performance. I have no doubt that significant progress will be possible, but it's unlikely that waiting lists can be cleared and other performance standards restored in one parliamentary term. Just as we in the NHS have turned around performance before, so we can do it again. Anyway, the point is, why is he mentioning parliamentary terms unless he's actually giving a license to Starmer and Streeting and the others to not do much at all in this next term and give them license to come in again and say, well, we haven't finished the work, we've got to do another term. I mean, that's not necessary. He doesn't have to talk about parliamentary terms at all. It's irrelevant. Now, this is Starmer's response. I was going to play Starmer's response to what Darzi's report is, and then I'm going to bring you in, Bob, because I'm sure everyone's fed up of listening to me jabbering on. Anyway, look, this is Starmer's response.
The NHS may be broken, but it's not beaten. As the report says, the NHS may be in a critical condition, but its vital signs are strong. And we need to have the courage to deliver long-term reform. Major surgery, not sticking plasters. We've got to face up to the challenges. Look at our ageing society, the higher burden of disease. And so the NHS is at a fork in the road. And we have a choice about how it should meet those demands. Don't act and leave it to die, raise taxes on working people, or reform to secure its future. Now, working people can't afford to pay more, so it's reform or die.
Well, there he goes. It's reform or die. So he's saying that I've got a license to do what I need to do, or it's never going to continue. Now, but Bob, I just picked up some of those things from the report, but you've picked up more. Do you want to say something in general first before I go through some of the slides that you sent me?
Yeah, thank you, Crispin. So just to point out some big issues here. First of all, the policy stream entirely follows on from what the Conservatives have done and from what New Labour did back in the early 2000s. The speed of production of this report and the extensive consultation, well, what that means is we've asked the privatization lobby to present us with a propaganda package which we can bamboozle the public with. What Starmer is delivering is very cleverly crafted wording, neuro-linguistic programming, they call it, whereby he's more or less frightening people to say, unless you let us do what we want, the NHS will no longer exist. And what Darzi outlines, remember Darzi was Blair's advisor back in the early 2000s. What Darzi has outlined is a continuation of profiteering by the private sector. And as you pointed out, he completely ignores all that really ails the NHS. The biggest one is PFI debt burden. And he also ignores the catastrophe of the staffing, which is not only are we having a hemorrhage, but we're also having a accelerating dumbing down agenda, replacing qualified people with less qualified people. So he ignores the real issues, and he scares us to death to say, let us do what we like, which is the same plan that the Tories had.
Yeah. Well, you sent me some slides that you took from things you took from the report. I'll just show them now, and you can talk about them. You've highlighted this section. Some sanity has been restored by the 2022 Act, which put integrated care systems on a statutory basis. Why do you think that's notable?
Yeah, so Darzi is here clearly rubber stamping the legislation that converted NHS in England to 42 public-private partnerships, these integrated care systems, which are modelled on the American system, which deliver profit through the denial of care. So New Labour, Starmer and Darzi have rubber stamped the Tories' massive betrayal of the NHS. The NHS we have now does not resemble the NHS of 1948 in legal terms, in structure, and in who's delivering the care.
Right, and this is another slide which mentions too great a share is being spent in hospitals, too little in the community, and productivity is too low. And you've highlighted patients no longer flow through hospitals as they should, and 13% of NHS beds are occupied by people waiting for social care. What's your reason for highlighting that?
So yeah, he identifies there's a problem with capacity. He fails to mention that New Labour and the Tories deliberately cut bed capacity. So they create a problem of capacity. Then who do they blame? They blame the elderly bed blockers. And why are they blocking the beds? Because they privatized social care. So we have private equity and for-profit organizations bleeding social care budgets dry. Do you see what's happened? So you create a problem and you scapegoat somebody else, meanwhile ignoring your own hand in creating the problem.
Wow. And this is another one about money. On top of that, there's a shortfall of £37 billion of capital investment. That sum could have prevented a backlog, maintenance, modernised technology and equipment, and paid for the 40 new hospitals that were promised. Why did you think that was worth highlighting?
Right, so 37 billion happens to be the amount of money the government wasted on the pandemic response, just out of interest by coincidence. We've been through this cycle before of famine and feast. So you have a Conservative administration who squeezes the budgets. Then you have New Labour coming to the rescue. But each time they inject more cash, they further send this money to the corporate private sector. This is the game they play. Good cop, bad cop, but they're on the same team because the plans divert money away from patient care into the private sector. And this whole narrative about moving care out of the hospitals might sound attractive, but what it means is we are replacing high quality care in hospital settings that should be delivered for a substitute service, which is going to be run by the private sector in the community using untested IT systems and without the workforce to back up the care. We have a community service which is barely functioning at the moment, and they're talking about transferring more care into non-existent services. So this is another democide that's going to take place, as demonstrated by the last administration, where they discharged 20,000 infected people into nursing homes with COVID-19 to cause a cull of the elderly population. Now, this is what Labour is proposing in their own, maybe a slower, less dramatic way, but you're dumping people out of hospitals without the service provision in the community.
Wow. And this is another slide which mentions lock in the shift of care closer to home, the neighbourhood NHS, and new multidisciplinary models of care. This is to do with, I suppose, the community stuff again, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's doubling down on that narrative. If you look at community care as it exists, there's a huge recruitment problem for district nursing. People with experience are leaving the service because they can see the standards are dropping. We're having a less qualified workforce being brought forward, and this workforce is high turnover, so you're never getting experience. You're getting the blind leading the blind, and you're getting a rapid decline in the quality of service. So people will be convinced that, you know, services in the community are safe, whereas actually they're unsafe, they're dangerous, and in a lot of places they're non-existent.
Right. And the last slide that you sent was this one: drive productivity in hospitals, better operational management, capital investment in modern buildings. There is enormous potential in AI to transform care and for life sciences breakthroughs to create new treatments. This is a motif of streeting as well, isn't it? Technology. It talks about digital from analog to digital. It sounds really amazing, doesn't it?
Yeah, so some of this capital investment may take the form of a new version of private finance initiative. They're talking about pushing out investigations and radiology out of the hospital setting into the high street. Guess who will be running these high street operations? The private sector. So, you know, this is again another shift of resource into private corporations, destabilizing the hospital setup and pretending that this is somehow bringing care closer to the patient. It's got absolutely nothing to do with improving patient care or outcomes. It's all about diverting money into the private sector. And if that's through AI, if that's through more and more bungs to the big pharmaceutical companies to produce next to useless or in fact harmless interventions, harmful interventions, then they want to do more of that. For example, they're pushing the insanity of prescribing statin drugs to 15-year-olds. Now, this is medicine and big pharma's influence gone mad. So this is the type of thing that they're pushing. It's got nothing to do with highly effective, proven and useful interventions. It's all about shifting money to the profits of big pharma companies and big IT companies.
Nicholas, this is how are you doing? You've got your son now, have you? You all right?
I have. Yep, he's fine for now.
All right, okay, well done. Now look, this is what you said when we talked about the Darzi report before it came out. This is your prediction, because he said he's going to do a very quick investigation into this. I bet he's already done it.
Yeah, I mean, they can just copy and paste what they've already got. It's the same stuff we're always hearing. We need more care in the community.
And your idea that he was going to mention more care in the community has certainly come true. That's central, like what Bob was saying. What would you like to say about that? I mean, what I've taken from what Bob said is that this is another way of getting more money out to private companies, because it's community health not paying as much for them as they'd like. There's a clip you sent me of Alan Milburn speaking on this, which is quite enlightening on the whole thing. So
yeah, it's about where it comes from. Yeah, have a look.
And he's supposedly advising streeting, or is close to streeting on all this.
The rising tide of chronic disease will drive the focus still harder away from episodic treatment, largely in hospitals, towards continuity in treatment, first in the community, and then, as telecare and telemedicine technology evolves, into people's homes. I've been particularly impressed by evidence here in the US from United Healthcare's Evercare model for older people, which, by expanding services in the community and intensively monitoring patients' conditions to catch illness early, is reducing hospitalisation rates and improving health outcomes. We're in the final stages of agreeing to pilot precisely this sort of approach with a number of primary care trusts in Britain in partnership with United Healthcare Group. An explicit objective of our reforms, therefore, is greater diversity in the range of providers.
A big shift in healthcare is moving from acute care hospitals and inpatient care into the home and the community setting.
Particularly in the community, the health service now faces competition from the private sector. In hospitals, private firms have won contracts that amount to 4% of what's spent overall. But there's been a rapid rise in private companies providing community healthcare. 18% of these services are now delivered by contractors on behalf of the NHS.
So, I mean, it's pretty clear what's going on in there, isn't it?
And what we see in the clips is Alan Milburn, who works for various private healthcare companies, talking about how that is, destiny, that this shall happen and must happen, that care goes into so-called the community and then into people's homes, and this talk about technology and so on, which we see in Darzi as well. And that's about a decade old. That one, most of those clips are about a decade old, but they're the same today. And then we see him when he was health secretary in Washington, talking about working with United Health to do all the stuff which passes for common sense today, keeping people out of hospital, the problem with bed blocking, the importance of care in the community, all the stuff that Darzi emphasizes heavily, and which is not really challenged on the left generally. It is challenged by people who analyze it, who write about it. Again, I say Open Democracy wrote a lot about that. Diane Abbott challenged it when we had someone on the left in Shadow Health, but most of the time it's not challenged as a privatization and dismantling of the NHS issue, which is what it is. So we see him, Alan Milburn says specifically that the point of their reforms is to introduce diversity in provision, which means non-NHS providers, which means private. And then we also hear Centine saying how this is basically fate, that everything's moving out of hospital just because, that's the way things are happening in the world. Evidently God wills it. Everything's like that. Everything's just happening. There's no actual political decision sort of highlighted, which is what's driving it. And then there's another report, which was actually Channel 5, which did a couple of, you can find interesting stuff in odd places like that. And again, it's old data, but they were talking about how privatized, outsourcing was increasing sharply in what's called care in the community. And they were talking about working on new models of care, which is still the same thing. It's about taking out the profitable bits from a general hospital. Circle Health tried to run a general hospital, didn't manage to, and we were very pleased with the reforms that Darzi approved. So Darzi's given an overview in which he appears to criticize people who've read things into it. They've read into an attack on privatization because he speaks ill of the 2012 Act. Well, actually, he mentions only good things about the subsequent, as Bob mentioned, and in your underlined bits, about the things that happened after the 2012 Act. It's a rhetorical flourish. Oh my God, the Act was bad. Nothing in it is against privatization. People have wanted to read an attack on privatization. In that, on the contrary, he speaks in favor of, you showed, of what's called insourcing, of private companies taking over, using, state hospitals and so on to make money. And he talks well of the internal market. All of this 30, 40-year process he talks positively about. And it's just, the bad 2012 Act. That's a rhetorical flourish. Some people who criticize that without criticizing the fact that it's about privatization are not allies. What they're saying is not in support of the NHS. And we have a lot of saying, oh, look, he criticized that, he's right. No, he criticized that in a way that is not on our side.
Can I just sort of come in? Because I've seen some responses from the left. Keep our NHS public was one. I also saw We Own It. And I thought their response was quite weak because they kind of saying, yeah, we do have a problem with the NHS, but we need to put more money into it. And it wasn't as if this was all a plan. They almost naively answer it as though it was a genuine report where he was looking for truth. Do you get that feeling that some people on the left don't actually acknowledge that this was all set up from definitely before the general election?
Yeah, I think there's a marked difference between, if you want to talk broadly about the left, is that, when people will read, I don't know, a report about a genocide, and they will see that it's framed and saying in a way that says people died when Israeli soldiers opened fire, and they'll read into that and they'll say, hang on, why aren't they mentioning that they were killed by the soldiers? I'm talking about reactions to political discourse. And then there's this stuff on the NHS, which is as political as you can get. and it's read literally like it's just a comment on the reality. Actually, there's been a fight over defining the problem, because if you define the problem, you are pointing people towards so-called solutions. And those solutions involve, in particular, the moving the profitable bits out of hospitals, closing the hospitals, like, you know, you had to fight for Charing Cross, Jeremy's for Whittington again, against this process of removing the profitable bits and closing down the rest, which is happening as national policy. So there is a failure to confront a political narrative for what it is, and I think that is because, in part, that political narrative has appeared to be hegemonic. It was hegemonic because Labour and Tory had the same narrative. John Ashworth before, you know, from the beginning was talking about Heidi Alexander. All those people were talking about how we need an honest conversation about funding. All of what they say is very, very carefully phrased to support the current process. So basically, Darzi is saying, we've talked a lot about moving care of hospitals. We haven't done enough of it. What he's saying is everything we've been doing so far has been fantastic, but we haven't done enough of it, and we need to put more into that. That's what he's really saying, at the same time as making it sound like he is, you know, making what sounds like comforting noises, but which we should not take as comforting because of what they really need.
So I'm just thinking, I've got to thank you for your contribution. Now, Bob, I just want to speak to you about your appearance on Talk TV that got some commentary on social media.
Well, clearly you don't understand healthcare.
No, I do understand healthcare. No, I do understand healthcare. Don't come on my show. Don't come on my show and insult the intelligence of my viewers and listeners by claiming that you are not a private healthcare provider and railing against the private sector. The reason you don't like the other private sector, the reason you don't like the other private sector,
you're extremely rude.
You are very rude yourself. The reason you don't like other private sector contractors is because they're bigger than you and the BMA can't control them. Fact.
Primary healthcare is the most efficient part of the health service. Continuity of care is one of the most important things. The secondary care sector is increasingly more and more expensive.
Well, Bob, I wouldn't do that to you. It's a bit mean. The thing that bugs me, I mean, laugh about it, but in a way, the media is just not picking up on this at all. They're not going into Darzi at all, what he's saying, and that's an example of it. It's sort of, if you want to say something, they just attack you personally, don't they?
Yeah, I don't think it's that the media don't get it. They are intrinsically part of the problem. They are the necessary propaganda wing of our political consensus, which is acting against the public interest. If I could just go back to something Nico mentioned, the Alan Milburn's attraction to what the Americans were doing, the Evercare project he talked about, moving care into the community. Well, first of all, America didn't have a well-established and well-run GP services. So when they transferred that system over to the UK, it made no difference whatsoever, because we had quite good primary care back in the early 2000s. So, you know, the BBC and these right-wing channels, they are part of a same program whereby the BBC does it in a more calm fashion and tries very hard to be appearing even-handed, whereas you've got the right wing like Talk TV, who invited me on and just didn't let me talk. And what the point he was trying to make is, I'm just as bad as a private corporation with shareholders as a GP. And I was trying to explain to him that in 1948, the GPs set up by N.R. and Bevan as independent contractors who are trained in the NHS, paid to a pension for the NHS, have everything decided about how they work by the NHS, is not the same as Richard Branson running a surgery.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't accept it.